so now we're looking, and I'm kind of surprised that this martini picture is surprisingly crude for their quality. But what I'm trying to show you is that there are three main layers to the eye, and what we have here is the fibrous layer on the outside. So this includes the sclera, and the visible part is the white of your eye. But notice that the sclera actually goes all the way to the back of your eye. When you have that clear, translucent cornea, then a little more deep to that, you have the vascular layer or the uvea. And if you know your Latin terms, this refers to I think it comes from the same root word as grape. But what we have here, the iris is part of that. So the iris is not part of the cornea sclera, it's just a part of a different layer. Then you have something called the choroid, and then you have the ciliary body and the lens. We'll get to that pretty soon. And then you have the innermost layer, and this is the retina. And notice that the retina is toward the posterior of the eye. And this is the part that detects light and absorbs light. And this is the part where you're actually wanting light to go through the cornea, through the lens, and end up on the retina. So it activates all these photoreceptors back here and goes to your optic nerve, and yeah, so that cranial nerve too, so you can have your sense of vision. Now let's look at this. Well, notice that the lens is the border between what we call the anterior cavity and the posterior cavity. And what do these cavities contain? So again, cavities, they're spaces. They're not things that just have air like we think, or they're not just simple holes like when we think of a cavity in our teeth. So what do they contain? Well, the anterior cavity, which is everything from the lens to that's more anterior, it contains a watery substance called aqueous humor, whereas the posterior cavity, what it contains is this jelly-like, and if you've seen the dissections, if you're taking the lab and saw the dissections, you might have seen this jelly-like thing in the sheep eye. So that's what we call vitreous humor. It's thicker than the aqueous humor we find in the anterior cavity, so it has all these proteins as well. So what is vitreous humor? So it is still mostly water, but or actually has things like electrolytes and metabolites, don't worry, but it has a lot of proteins, so this is why it's more jelly-like. So, or if you think of jello is pretty much, gelatin is ground up like keratin because it's made from hooves and horns and whatnot. So I guess like, yeah, so that's the thing, if you have this thick mixture of water and protein, you're going to get jelly-like substance. And you also have polysaccharides, so you have some sugars in there as well. And what are these functions? Well, the thing is that the vitreous humor, this helps to maintain your eye shape. You're moving all the time, or if you have like a water balloon and carry it around, does the water balloon remain rigid as you're carrying it around? You notice that the water balloon tends to wobble? Well, if your eye didn't have its vitreous humor and just had pure water, your eye might be prone to distorting and changing shape. If that happened, then that will also change the shape of light entering your eye, and you would have a hard time keeping focus. But another interesting thing too is that remember that choroid layer, or actually that retinal layer. So that retinal layer, that innermost layer, well, what is that doing? Well, the interesting thing is that this retina, it needs to stay plastered to the back of your eye. So it's kind of like having a projection screen. If the projection screen is starting to fall over or tear or start to crumple and wrinkle, you're not going to get a clear picture, right? Same thing with the retina. If it starts to detach from the choroid, it's going to pretty much result in distortions or loss of vision at the areas of detachment. So that vitreous humor actually helps because due to being very thick and taking up this volume here, it actually helps to plaster that retina against the walls of your eye, so it keeps it in place and prevents it from detaching and wrinkling and tearing. Now, what do we see here? So I have these too, but yeah, if you have floaters, you might see these little shadowy, ghostly like things. And have you noticed that they kind of move around when you move your head, or when you move your eye around, they also move around as well and bounce around in your field of vision. So what are these floaters? Well, let's look at the anatomy of the eye. So again, remember I said that retina is like a projection screen? Well, things that your eye lets in light. But what happens if you have a light and you put an object between the light or if you're looking at a source, or If you're looking at light and something comes between you and the light, what does that do? That object starts to cast a shadow. So same with these floaters. If they're things like protein fibers or some sort of protein globules, well, they're going to cast a shadow on your retina, and this is why you kind of see these ghostly-like floaters. So yeah, as these floaters move around, as you move your eyes, well, what's that going to do? That image and ghostly image of that floater is going to move around in your field of vision as well. Okay, so again, light enters through your cornea, so it is a clear type of lens, and then you also have the hard lens right here. So your cornea, your sclera, your choroid, and your retina. Now let's look at the choroid. So what is the choroid? Again, it is a continuous layer, but with that uvea. But you have these little projections right here, and these are what you call ciliary bodies. And notice that they're kind of throwing these little threads over here toward this lens of your eye. So what are these projections? These are called ciliary processes. And then what we have here are suspensory ligaments. So they're these little protein fibers that help to keep your lens in place.